Dear viewers, on behalf of School of Translation Studies and Training and Indira Gandhi National Open University, I take this opportunity to welcome all of you across the country and the globe. Today, we shall have an interactive session on educational and cultural transaction in the 19th century India. And to lead the interaction, we have Professor Vivienne Wormfield from University of Glasgow. She is an International Dean for South Asia and Professor of Pedagogy at the University of Glasgow. She is responsible for developing partnerships between the University of Glasgow and universities in South Asia in general and India in particular. She has a very illuminating career in research in pedagogy and has done a lot of publications in that particular area. She conducts research into the creation and translation of knowledge about teaching and learning. It would be of great interest to us that her PhD was on the educational philosophy of Swami Vivekananda, and keeping that in view, 19th century happens to be her area of interest, and which she beautifully compares with the international perspective, particularly European and English perspective. Her book on Vivekananda is a part of British Library, and it has been highly anthologized in different forms, including in a book by Oxford University Press. Welcome, Professor Wormfield.
Thank you.
Along with Professor Wormfield, we have two colleagues from the school, Dr. Rajendra Prasad Pandey ji and Dr. Jagdish Sharma ji, and they would also take part in interaction and would contribute through their interventions in the form of questions and observations. Similarly, we have our colleagues and research scholars in student studios. We would be happy to include their observations towards the end. Coming to the topic that is educational and cultural transaction in the 19th century India, usually it is put in the colonial period, the category of colonial period. The fact is that there was almost half a century before it and half a century after it. That is 1757 to 1947 is often put in the category of the colonial period. However, the insightful students of history, they say that that entire period is not the period of colonial India. 1757 to 1857 was the period of East India Company's occupation, and subsequently 1758 onwards was the real colonial period. That is the game that scholars play with terms and terminologies, but the fact is that in Indian cultural history, 19th century played a very vital role in all domains. All of us know that by this time Asiatic society was established, and two texts that ultimately led to the generation of enormous interest in India, they were translated. Gita was translated by Charles Bilkins. Abhigyan Shakuntalam was translated by William Jones. And William Carey's translations of Bible in 56 Indian languages, they were also available before the century began. The discipline called Indology was established by this time, and all these Indologists had a kind of romantic involvement with what is often called as fossilized India, Sanskrit India or Sanskritized India. But there were again the British people, personnels, officials working in India that took interest in the social reformation as well. William Wenticke's name is known to all of us, and subsequently people like Raja Ram Mohan Roy and others took lead, and it led to ultimately a kind of redefining contours of Indian society. Different societies came in existence. Brahma Samaj was one subsequently. Then Dayanand Saraswati established his own, that was of course in the second half of the 19th century. But along with this, what one finds is that different education systems were also being put into practice. Pathshalas and madrasas were already there, but along with that, new education system came in existence, and that is English education system. The fact is that this entire period was a period of cultural confluence of two knowledge systems or two civilizations. People are very fond of the term clash, but clash of civilizations, but I often say that this was clash should be replaced with confluence. And in confluence there is influence and reception both at both the ends. This took place, and the knowledge systems that were in existence in India in different domains, they were getting translated. Legal text like Manusmriti was translated as laws of Manu. Then subsequently the Upanishads and Vedas came to be translated. Then it was in this period that Max Muller did his entire project, and one can say that the pinnacle of this development was his lectures before ICS officials who were to come to India and govern the country. And instead of telling them what they have to go and teach India, his lectures were called in a book form as What India Can Teach Us. On the one hand, this was the picture. On the other hand, there were people who were taking a lot of interest in Indian languages as well. It was a period in which grammars of modern Indian languages were also prepared by different people, and first census took place. Grierson's linguistic survey of India took place in this particular period. The people like Grierson, Waterfield, they were equally interested in the folklore of India. So what they did was a text like Alkhand, which deals with the bravery of Indian folk heroes of half a century, that is 1150 to 1192. And these folk epics were sung by the people in the northern India particularly, but they were not transcribed. So what these people did was that they transcribed them, and Waterfield translated them as well. Even today we think that cultural and folklore cannot be translated. And Ala is a typical indigenous meter, and he translated into ballad. So that the description part is taken over, and they make us realize the kind of work that was being done. The motives may be questioned, motives may be adduced also, but it is always not very good to be too skeptical, because the work that was done during this period was of enormous cultural importance to all of us. In the same way, in the educational field, as I said earlier, the Anglo-Indian schools, colleges were being established, Sanskrit colleges, because these scholars thought that it's possible to know India through Sanskrit and by teaching and learning Sanskrit. All of them were opened in different parts, along with the universities in Bombay, Chennai, and the then Madras University and Calcutta University. All these played a new role in defining the history of India, because the new middle class that came in existence, that was educated in this education system, in these universities, ironically proved to be a class that in a way led the freedom struggle against the British. Subsequently, we feel like Vivekananda was a product of this education system. Aurobindo was a product of this particular system. Gandhi was a product of this particular system. Not in India, but he had his higher education in England. But the ideals that they brought with them, they were perhaps more informed and shaped by the other Europe, or the kind of spirit for liberation, freedom, liberty, and the ideals that were there. They were all imbibed by them after going through this education system. So it is often called as the period of Indian Renaissance. So that is also being questioned these days, because the scholars like Professor Cohn, they said there was not Renaissance in India. In fact, India translation of Indian texts into European languages led to second Renaissance in Europe. Raymond Schwartz and Cohn. So these are all academic issues, but since you deal with these issues in your own way, let me begin with a very general kind of thing, your observations about 19th century India. Please.
Right. Thank you very much. I agree very much with the idea that it's fruitful to think about the confluence and the interaction and transaction between different people and systems. I mean, I'm a professor of pedagogy, and essentially pedagogy is about understanding transactions, really, how knowledge is transacted, because in teaching and learning you can't transmit knowledge, you can't give people knowledge, you need to interact with people, and through interaction then knowledge is created and translated. So the connection between my interest in pedagogy and my interest in Vivekananda and 19th century Bengal is I was fascinated, it was a long time ago now, as an undergraduate student. I first came across the writings of Vivekananda, and that was in 1975, a long time ago. And what interested me about him was exactly what you've just been describing, the way in which this individual who basically had a English education, and yet was able to take that and to turn it on its head, really, to challenge the assumptions, to challenge the deficit model of the Indian, the idea that there was somehow a superiority and an inferiority in the relationship. And he challenged that head on and said, no, let's look at what we share, let's look at what the exchange can be. And the skill with which he was able to challenge and persuade and change, and the way that he did that through his own interactions. There is a very old recording of him speaking in Chicago at the World Parliament of Religions. And he arrived in America completely unknown. He wasn't well known in India at that point, and he was completely unknown in America. And it was through the sheer power of his personality and his eloquence that he was able to communicate and to inspire interest. And through his lecture tours around the USA, around England, and around India, very little of what he did he sit down in a study and write. He did most of it extempore by talking, lecturing, and it was other people that wrote down what he said. So reading his work is fascinating and also frustrating, I think, because it's fascinating because his personality comes off the page even now. You can hear him. But it's frustrating because it's not always particularly disciplined, because he was actually just talking to people and persuading. But the way that he used his personality, he used his knowledge, he used the media. He was a very early example of using the print media to good effect in order to motivate and inspire. And the other thing about him was the way in which he was very interested in education and the power of education and what it could do. And he was able to attract to him some very interesting educators. Somebody I think who's a very interesting person is Sister Nivedita, who remarkably settled in Calcutta and started a school for girls. And the courage that she had and the determination to do that, I think, is also very interesting. So he was very passionate about education and how education can transform. I've written about the way in which he looked at education at that time. And he didn't want to polarize. He didn't like the kind of opposition between East and West. Yes. And so his theories about education was that it was empowering, that it was through education that you could change, and that education was vital for India. And he used his own knowledge to get that message across. But he said some interesting things which we can still learn from today, I feel. For example, that he was a champion of interdisciplinarity. His famous phrase, science and Sanskrit, you know, that it wasn't an either or. At that time, as you said, there was this view that Sanskrit and traditional values and traditional Indian philosophy was in the past, it was fossilized, it was not part of the modern world. And in fact,
before we go to the specialized part of it, we would like to know about his educational philosophy, because he gave altogether different definition of education. Like, you know, you mentioned about education as transaction. The knowledge cannot be transmitted.
Yes.
The transaction takes place.
Yes.
But he said that education is manifestation of.
Yes, of what's within.
What is within.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that means a teacher is not supposed to bring about a kind of thing that is already not in the student. That infinite possibilities are already in the student. Teacher's job is to manifest those possibilities and in a way that the student realizes his enormous potentialities. What is in his educational vision that interested you, that you know, that you went on to do your PhD on Vivekananda? Because again this year we are celebrating Vivekananda's centenary.
It was the way in which, I mean, for me, before studying Vivekananda, I'd not studied Indian philosophy at all. And so for me, I was fascinated by this idea of learning as the removal of barriers. So when he talks about the idea that you draw out, that people have infinite potential. I mean, I think that's the idea about empowering people. It doesn't matter who you are on the outside. Within you, you have the potential. You have the potential to become whatever you want to become, because the potential is infinite. And so what education does is it actually removes the barriers. Ignorance is a closing. It's a lack of vision. It's not that you don't have something. It's that you don't know that you have something. And so so the idea of realization, and those kinds of ideas were very new to me. And so I became fascinated, and so not only did I study Vivekananda, before I could do that, I had a very strict professor, so I had to learn Sanskrit, and that was a struggle. I found that very difficult but very interesting, because again that showed me really that there are things that you can say in certain languages that you can't say in other languages, because there's so much that you can't understand about Indian thought generally unless you have at least a rudimentary understanding of some of the language and the terms, because we don't have English words for many of these things. I mean, English we do tend to polarize. I mean, the Western academic tradition tends to set up an argument, whereas I found this more fluid and ultimately more challenging way of thinking about things, not making easy oppositions, but actually saying, well, it's not either or, it's either or both. Neither, you know. So that kind of thinking. So I found Vivekananda, I suppose he was a bridge for me, because he was Western educated, because he spoke as much to an American and a British audience as he did to an Indian audience initially. I suppose he was a way of helping me to gain more understanding of a period of great flux and interaction. And like you, I think you could question the motives of some of the early British administrators and officials, but then you look at the ones, I mean, they weren't all the same, but the ones who developed a love of Indian learning and knowledge. You know, if you go to Calcutta and you look at the Prinsep Memorial, you know, suddenly by the river, you've got this Greek building which looks completely out of place, but put up as a monument to a man who devoted his whole life to Indian thought. You know, I mean, he was a clerk, he was an administrator, but in his spare time he actually translated Brahmi, and so that passion and interest and that mixing up of things is interesting. But Vivekananda himself, I think what he did was he popularized some very complex ideas, and through his mission and idea about education, he made some very complicated ideas about Vedanta accessible to a wider audience, including people like me.
You are absolutely right. In fact, in Vivekananda, there is a kind of, you know, paradigm. A paradigm is that he is making Vedanta, even Sankhya and philosophical schools and their teachings available to the people, even non-Indians, because he is doing all this through English. But he quotes from Sanskrit the least. He does quote, but his quotations, in fact, you know, one can learn how to quote from Vivekananda, because in humanities we overquote. We go for long quotations, but he quotes and gives the gist of that quotation. Otherwise, the rest of the places we have to find that this is the thought he is taking from Vedanta or from Upanishad, but he is not translating in the English sense of the term, but Indian sense of the term, where he is rewriting or rewording the thought in the way it becomes accessible to the people. In fact, you know, it's a very good lesson for the people to see if the message is to be communicated. You can take an idea from a classical text, but present it in a way that the people who do not know that, even they can know that tradition, they can also know that. Only in terms of concepts, he doesn't hesitate to transfer those concepts as such. So that is something that would give a kind of, you know, lesson to all of us today. But in case Vivekananda, we feel tempted to ask you another thing, another question. Like his focus was on youth and women. Because his essays like Modern India or The Future of India, his audience is very clear in his mind. He is very proud of the tradition. At the same time, he is pragmatic enough to take the best from all of the traditions, Christianity and Islam, and then he makes it available scientifically, and he talks to students, to women in particular, to he is one who begins to talk about Daridra Narayan, that the poor person is the God. That is happening. So, what about this message that he gave along with this education philosophy that you have?
I think that was one of the things that was very inspiring about him, was his interest in making, I mean, he was interested in the living tradition, and he wanted to pass things on to the next generation, but he also wanted the next generation to have the confidence to shape things and to move forward into the future. And so he made a point of addressing audiences, some of the speeches he gave, like the speech he gave in Lucknow, which was a really important speech, which he gave at the college there, to an audience of students and young people. And he did actually have many women disciples who actually were following, and
you referred to Sister Nivedita.
Yes, and Sarah Bull, and all the other Americans who came and supported him. So he was, I think, a very charismatic personality, and he certainly believed in young people actually taking charge and moving forward, and that the tradition was not a dead thing, it was a living thing. So his idea about science and Sanskrit, and his idea about playing football, don't just study the Gita, you need to play football as well, because you need both. So I mean, and I think for us now, looking at education, looking at schooling, we have lots of debates still, and I'm sure you do here in India as well, about specialising, about the arts and humanities becoming separated from the sciences, the idea that philosophy is not something for everyday life, it's a kind of esoteric thing that academics study in libraries, and it doesn't mean anything for the modern world. And the idea, we have a lot of debate about health and well-being, that how do you bring scholarly study and active life together. And he very early on was saying, the past is in the present, and the tradition is alive and can inform what we do, that we can bring together the humanities and sciences, they don't have to be separate.
I think you're absolutely right. He brought Indians, he made them free from sense of shame. And made them proud about it. I think to make our discussion very broad-based around this 19th century cultural transaction, we would request Sharma ji to join with your observation, or we would have it around the topic, and all of us may join. Please.
I don't have actually any major observation to make, but I am really interested to know, Professor Warmfield. You mentioned that it's really pleasing and really enriching yourself to learn and read Swami Vivekananda and his teachings. At the same time, you mentioned it is frustrating also. And Professor Singh has already mentioned how Vivekananda really represented true India. Rather, he is still till date he is considered to be the person who has really represented Indian truism. The kind of approach that he had in approaching the West with the large traditions of Indian literature, Indian knowledge systems, and the treasures of the Indianness, what was the approach that he could really bring the true India to the West? As a professor of pedagogy, how do you look at this approach? This is really interesting.
I mean, when I said it was frustrating, I think I meant in the sense that he died very young. He had a very, very active life. I mean, just studying where he was at any particular time. I mean, the journeys he did around India alone, but also his journeys to England, his journeys to America, his journeys to Europe. He was always on the move. And what's frustrating is I wish, in a way, he'd had time to sit, and perhaps if he'd lived longer, he would have had time to sit and really codify and elaborate and fully develop the ideas that he had. So you get these little snatches of ideas, and like you say, that they're very stimulating and attractive. But then I suppose it's because I studied him for a PhD, and you know what writing a PhD is like. You know, imagine taking the whole of the writings of Vivekananda in English, which are volumes and volumes, and then trying to fit that within a kind of academic tradition of writing a PhD. He doesn't fit into PhDs very easily. I don't think he would have had much patience with that. He wanted to communicate. So I think in terms of his pedagogy, then I think he was very powerful because he himself had a very good command of Western ideas, and his education meant that he could work between two worlds. He had a good understanding of the Indian scriptures, he had a good understanding of the Indian tradition, but he'd also studied Western philosophy, Western literature, and so he was between the two worlds and equally comfortable in either of them, and could see potential in both, but actually believed that, I think, that the Indian, or at least the Vedanta way of understanding knowledge and experience was the way in which you made sense of the world. And so that is what he tried to share with people. And I found that fascinating. I mean, interestingly, though, he did get in trouble with some Indologists. So when he met Paul Deussen, Paul Deussen was very superior and didn't think that Vivekananda was a good enough scholar, which is quite amusing in a way. And so he was not a traditional Indologist. He was doing something much more vibrant. That wasn't what he was trying to do. He wasn't trying to explain the Indian tradition to Western audiences. He was trying to show how in the modern world these ideas had the potential to solve problems and to help people to move forward. So,
before other colleagues join, I feel tempted at the moment to make one observation, and that's a question also. Like as I said earlier, Vivekananda was translating Indian knowledge and making it available to the people in the West through English. Didn't quote much. There are two processes that seem to be in existence in that period. That is, Indologists are translating India from the viewpoint of knowledge. The British administrators, they are, if I can use the term metaphorically, they are translating India, wherein my meaning of translation is, they are trying to refashion India.
Codify and
refashion India the way they wanted India to be. So is it possible for us to say that in a way Vivekananda was translating India from an Indian perspective to the West in English to a larger audience, and in a way his translation of India, not word by word, or his translation of India prepared a kind of background for people, others like Aurobindo and others to follow. Had Vivekananda not been there, Aurobindo would have taken much more time to have a ready-made audience for that kind of knowledge system. Now, therein I feel tempted, because your research basically is on translation of knowledge. and pedagogy. How do you deal with this issue in terms of pedagogy, translation of knowledge or creation and translation of knowledge? What are the processes, or what is it that you focus on?
Right.
Because that is of direct interest.
Yes, yes. Well, interestingly, that there is another parallel there, because what I'm very interested in is the role of inquiry and the way that in informal learning, so when you're not in school and not in a classroom, everybody learns all the time. And the way that they learn is through inquiry triggered by experience. So most of the time we live fairly routine, and we have habits and we know how things work, and then there's some interruption to that. I mean, the psychologists would call it a cognitive conflict. There's an interruption, and that poses a question for us, and we have to work out what to do, how to do something, why has this happened, and that's how we learn. So I'm very interested in how informal contexts where we have a curriculum, so it's not an open-ended inquiry, but at the same time our power to learn is very much rooted in our curiosity and in our inquiry. And so I'm interested in how can a teacher in a classroom with a curriculum actually untap the potential of learners to learn, and that potential is through reflection on experience and inquiry. And that links very closely, not just with Vivekananda, who also talked about that, but it does link very closely to the models of teaching that you get within the Indian tradition. So if you look at the Upanishads, if you look at the work of Shankara, then the way in which those teachers taught was through questioning. The kind of guru-shishya relationship is to question, and to ask questions, and through questioning to accumulate and to reveal the knowledge. So they're not necessarily lecturing, they are answering questions and guiding. And so I think it's very interesting to look at that. And there is another connection, because Vivekananda, we know, did have some quite close interaction with the New England transcendentalists, and they're the people who went on to develop theories of education in America. So he spent some time with people, William James, who wrote a book called Psychology for Teachers. And we know that Vivekananda and William James had conversations. William James, of course, in his book on religious experience, used Vivekananda as an example. So they obviously had quite long conversations. And then John Dewey, who did a lot of work on education, and particularly this idea that you can't tell people things, you can help people to discover what they know. So a piece of work that I would very much like to do is to look at the parallels between, or the confluence between American pragmatism and Vivekananda's practical Vedanta, because I think there were similar things happening, and we know that there were some encounters. They did meet, they did talk. How much of those ideas they shared is a bit of a detective job, and I would love to do the detective work to find out how they learnt from each other, because certainly once you go beyond Vivekananda and start looking at, a colleague of mine has written a book about Shankara and how he taught, and she's written about the way that he used questioning, and how in kind of modern thinking about teaching and learning and modern theories of cognition, we're actually coming to some of these ideas again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pandeyji has...
Warmfield, actually we were discussing about transactions in 19th century India, and this is very interesting that we have taken Vivekananda as central figure to correlate things. And my basic point is that we have been discussing the two educational system, and we, especially if we refer to Vivekananda, he talks of the value education system, and that is internalization of knowledge. Like if I quote from Sanskrit text, Shil Vrittam Phalam Shutam. So this is what we intended and we meant for education. So it is not just taking and getting information, but just to internalize things and to practice, put into practice. If it is not reflected in personality and character of a person, one is not educated in true sense of term. And this is what Vivekananda was trying to do. So if you look at the Vivekananda's philosophy, he adopted both the knowledge systems and philosophy of thought of West, one a priori knowledge system and the other empirical knowledge system. So keeping in view the synthesis made by Vivekananda, how do you analyze his contribution to the philosophy of the world as such? How did he was able to succeed in terms of defining knowledge and putting Vedanta practicable knowledge system rather than that of an illusory knowledge system. So if you have to make an analogy with Western philosopher, whom do you find closer to Vivekananda's philosophy? So this very simple thing, and if time permits, then we'll have discussion. Yeah.
I would think John Dewey.
John Dewey.
John Dewey, yeah.
I would think there, I think.
So,
other than that, I think what Pandeyji said, in Vivekananda's vision of education being manifestation of what's already within, the focus was on character building and value-based education. In fact, component that's missing from our system, and these days in last 10 years or so there has been a lot of talk about it. Unfortunately, the problem with value-based education is that it's very difficult to measure it. Even if you teach how to measure it, that's an issue. But lots of new experiments are being done, particularly by Ramakrishna Mission schools, and to good extent they have become successful in arousing curiosity and making values, if not something to be instructed, but something that can be learned, particularly through the behavior of the teachers and people all around. I think one of our colleagues here, Manjit ji.
Where in 19th century India, where do you situate 19th century India if you keep that larger world in mind? That is number one. And secondly, this particular world, once again, from South Asia to all the way to West Asia, by 19th century, early 20th century, we actually have three major, let's say, European powers, which even in the knowledge sector played a role. Where English, the British, and the French, and then came the Germans. Do you see that all these three societies or say nations engaged with this whole engagement in three different ways, or do you see some similarities in the way they mapped, let's say, their respective colonies they engaged with?
I mean, I suppose one of the issues really is, I think, picking up Professor Singh's point earlier, is that one of the things that was going on is the British wanted to codify. We wanted everything being very bureaucratic. We wanted everything neat. And so we did lots of mapping and audits and surveys and wanted to try and tidy up India and say, well, where do you belong and what's your religion and what language do you speak? And that was going directly against this fluidity, this people didn't think like that, people didn't put themselves in those boxes. So there's a tension there between wanting to administrate and therefore to have systems and put people in compartments versus this culture that had always been very fluid and actually had lots of interactions and confluence across the world. I suppose what I really studied was Bengal anyway, not the whole of India, and I think that's something else, but I can see we're running out of time, so we can't even begin to say where does Bengal sit within the wider picture of India, never mind within the world. And I mean, it's interesting if you take Vivekananda as a point of reference. He had an impact in England, also in Germany and in France. And I think it is very interesting if you look at how somebody like Romain Rolland, how he responded to Vivekananda and wrote about him within a kind of French tradition. And if you look at the way the British responded to him and how they wrote about him, and then how the German Indologists like Deussen responded to him, and that there's three different, I mean, we're stereotyping, but there were three quite different reactions and interactions, and that would, in itself would be a nice little article to write, actually.
I fully agree, but one has to admit that there are multiple perspectives to look at. Politically, the fact is that India was defeated. 1857, thereafter the sense of loss was there. The thing is that even in the 19th century, there are two parallels. One is romantic engagement with India. Even within Germany, there is a group of Indologists like Schlegel and others. They are Schopenhauer elsewhere. Then that they are romanticizing India. At the same time, Hegel onwards, Hegel to Heidegger up to 1942, there is a tradition that says that there is no philosophy, no science, no objective value system available in any system other than Greek and European. So this is a non-romantic engagement, parallel, going on parallel. At the same time, they are mostly concerned with the fossilized India and Sanskrit. Subsequently, they got interested in contemporary India, and then it became all interventionist. But at the same time, by the time what happens is that all other interests, they are almost sidelined. France was interested, but France was reduced to Pondicherry. Portuguese were interested, politically they were confined only to Goa. So there are different snapshots of India that emerge. Culturally, one can say, oh, yes, India was creating a kind of, Indian knowledge systems were creating kind of impact, but otherwise, by 1915 or so, that prominence of India was lost. To put it, because Max Muller's lectures are the last word that eulogize India for its knowledge system. Thereafter, they are more concerned with India, that is the present India. The thing is that scholars from culture, scholars from humanities, from translation studies, along with the social scientists, they have to use all these as core texts. What we are doing is we are studying just as texts, but all these core texts have to be put together so that some less incomplete picture emerges. And Vivekananda can be one starting point, Aurobindo can be, Dayanand Saraswati, Sir Syed Ahmad. All these are the hinges on whom or around whom it is possible to build a discourse. The 19th century was so fertile that it's very difficult to come to a conclusion, because same person, different roles are seen. Bhartendra Desai, for instance, in Hindi, he was playing different roles as a journalist, as a poet, as a dramatist, social reformer. All these things they were doing. We are yet to come to terms with the protean nature of the body of knowledge that was available in the society. I think, keeping the constants of time in view, we, on behalf of the school and the university, we thank you, Professor Baumfield, all colleagues here on this side and colleagues there, and our scholars for being for this particular session. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.